GPU pricing is still effed up, but how effed up has it become since the start of this year? That's what I'm investigating in today's video. Like I did a couple of months ago, I want to put numbers to the situation because we keep hearing about how AI demand is killing memory prices, how consumers won't be able to buy hardware anymore, and how things just keep getting worse. But are things actually getting worse in the graphics card market? And if so, how much worse are things getting? And are there any interesting trends we can observe? This will ultimately tell us how much AI companies and PC parts vendors are screwing over regular gamers at the moment. I'm going to look at, once again, our graphics card pricing data from 10 countries. This gives us the most complete picture of GPU prices worldwide and isn't just isolated to the US market. I've got data from November of 2025. This is when GPU prices were at their lowest. I've got the data from the last video in February and then updated data for April 2026. In all cases, we're looking at the lowest price for in-stock available models. I used price comparison websites tailored to each region to find the best price, so there are many retailers included here. It should be an accurate look at how much it costs at minimum to purchase a given GPU in each country. But before I get into it, today's video is brought to you by the Gigabyte MO27Q28G, a fantastic OLED gaming monitor that we highly recommend. The MO27Q28G is a 1440p 280Hz tandem W OLED with excellent performance, including up to 1500 nits of peak HDR brightness, deep blacks with per pixel control, and great factory calibration, which all come together to deliver a top-tier HDR gaming experience at a decent, affordable price. And look out for the glossy version, the MO27Q28GR, that's coming soon. Gigabyte also offer the MO32U2, a 32-inch 4K 240Hz QD OLED, which is one of our favorite gaming OLED panels. The MO32U2 is regularly one of the cheapest 4K QD OLEDs. I love the design and, of course, its HDR performance with up to 1000 nits of brightness. You might also consider the upcoming MO32U2 4 refresh, which is even brighter. To learn more about Gigabyte's excellent gaming OLEDs, check the link in the video description. Here's the current situation for Nvidia's entry-level models, the GeForce RTX 5050 and RTX 5060. Not much has changed for these cards compared to February. The RTX 5050 is 3% more expensive, and the RTX 5060 is about the same on average across these 10 regions. This does vary from place to place. The US is getting stung pretty hard with both models going up by about 10%, but in other regions the RTX 5060 has actually gotten cheaper. Its lowest price is now 8% lower in Australia, 7% lower in the UK, and 8% lower in India than it was a few months ago. However, pricing in general is still quite a bit higher now than in the good times of late 2025. Back then, entry-level GPUs were typically at or slightly below the MSRP. In April 2026, these cards are about 5% above the US MSRP globally on average. This has been calculated by taking the US MSRP, which is the most heavily advertised price at the launch of the cards, and converting it into a local true MSRP for each country after applying a currency conversion and local taxes. This tells us how badly each country is getting screwed in their local market compared to the US launch price. The RTX 5060 Ti series is an interesting one looking at pricing between February and April. The 8GB model has actually fallen in price in most regions, down by as much as 13% in Germany and the Netherlands, though in both cases this is a correction back to the price this model was available in November. This GPU is also cheaper in places like Poland and Canada without returning to November pricing, and it's more expensive in the US. On average, the 8GB model is 3% cheaper today, and it sits 2% below its launch price, making this the model where GPU buyers are getting screwed over the least. The situation is much worse for the RTX 5060 Ti 16GB. Pricing for this model did fall in a couple of regions, most notably the Netherlands, where pricing was high in February. However, in 7 regions, the 16GB model either stayed at the same price or got more expensive. This model is up 2% on average, but the killer is that it's priced 23% above the MSRP, so essentially prices are being maintained at a high level for this card. The screw factor is especially bad in places like Canada and India, where the card is overpriced by at least 30%. Next up, the 70 series. Buyers in the US are really getting screwed over right now when it comes to the RTX 5070, with prices up 15% compared to February and 31% compared to November. Pricing here is also unusual given in some regions the 5070 became cheaper over the last few months, and on average this model is just 2% more expensive now. However, globally it sits 11% above the MSRP, or as much as 19% above in Canada. Then we have the RTX 5070 Ti. Pricing for this model has stabilized at a high level, in fact falling slightly in most regions compared to the highs of February. On average, this model is 3% cheaper in April, but it remains 23% above the MSRP worldwide, or as much as 32% above the MSRP in the US. Once these models hit the $1,000 US mark, interest fell off a cliff, and with very few resupplies, pricing is not corrected in any significant way. The 5070 Ti is also a great example of why we need to create true MSRPs for some regions. In Germany, the current price for a 5070 Ti is €910, which doesn't sound so bad when you see that it's listed at an MSRP of €880 on the Nvidia website. Sure, it's 21% more expensive than the November price, but it's just 3% above the supposed MSRP. Isn't that actually decent? Well, not really, because the €880 launch price was always ridiculous given the advertised US MSRP was $750. When you convert 750 USD to euros and add Germany's 19% sales tax, the actual MSRP should have been €760, roughly the price this card was selling for in November. This is why I'm saying this card is 20% above the MSRP in Germany right now. I'm looking at today's price relative to the US MSRP that was used at the global announcement. Nvidia's high-end models are stupidly expensive right now, making them difficult to recommend to anyone. The GeForce RTX 5080 has dropped in price by 4% across these 10 regions compared to February. However, it's still 23% above the MSRP on average. People in the US are paying a minimum of $1,300 for a 5080, and in other regions you're typically looking at spending the equivalent of at least $1,200 US. The RTX 5090, is this even a gaming GPU at this point? Prices have gone up by 5% from February to April, and on average these models are selling for 77% above the MSRP. At a price tag of $3,500 to $4,000 US, there's very few gamers that could justify purchasing this GPU for gaming. It's really a workstation card at this point, though of course by counting it as a gaming GPU, Nvidia gets a nice boost to their gaming division revenue in their financial reports. This is the situation with AMD's entry-level graphics cards. On average, there hasn't been much change in pricing between February and April. In some regions, RX 9060 XT models are now cheaper, like in Australia, Germany, and Poland. In other regions, most notably the US, the 9060 XT is now a bit more expensive. This means that across the board, we are still seeing higher prices than November, especially for the 16GB model that's in much greater demand. When we look at how much gamers are getting screwed, the 9060 XT 8GB is currently 6% above its MSRP globally, and the 16GB model is 16% above. So, as expected, there's been a larger increase for the model with more memory. The level to which you are getting screwed, though, does depend on the region. The 16GB card is 26% above the MSRP in the US, but just 11% above in the Netherlands. Then we have AMD's higher-end Radeon cards. The RX 9070 is unchanged in price on average comparing February to April, though of course there are some differences from region to region. The card is much cheaper in Australia, for example, while the price is 7% higher in the US and India. At the moment, you're having to spend about 8% more than the MSRP, with the Philippines getting hit especially hard. The card is 17% more expensive than it should be over there. The 9070 XT saw a downward price movement of 4%, among the largest I've recorded comparing February to April. In most regions, this card is now slightly cheaper than it was previously, or roughly the same price, but only in a few regions like Poland is this card sitting around the mark of November pricing. On average, this model is sitting 8% above the MSRP, which isn't ideal, but is on the lower end of the how much are you getting screwed scale. Lastly, we have Intel's Arc Battlemage graphics cards. The B570 and B580 both saw a 4% price increase on average from February to April, though some regions were spared or even got slightly cheaper. The price increases for the B580 are particularly brutal in India and Brazil, and in some regions Intel Arc cards are not in the best supply. Right now, you're faced with spending 8% more than the MSRP on a B570 and 16% more on a B580, which is not ideal when the closest cards in price from AMD and Nvidia aren't quite this inflated. With all of this data at hand, we have a great insight into how GPU pricing has evolved in 2026, not just in the US, but on a more global scale. Based on my analysis of 10 regions, GPU pricing in general is actually unchanged comparing February to April. So even though we are seeing all these stories about memory prices continuing to rise, SSDs going through the roof, GPU pricing is stagnant for now. This does vary, of course, from model to model and from region to region. The US is actually one of the worst regions for graphics card pricing at the moment, rising 5% on average from February to April. But then in some regions, GPUs have actually gotten about 5% cheaper, like in Australia and Germany, while several other regions are flat. The reason why GPU prices have plateaued for now is because demand has fallen through the floor. Speaking to retailers in our region and looking at sales data for retailers that provide it, graphics card sales are well down on typical levels. This means a significant portion of stock you are seeing at retailers right now is the same stock from previous months at the same prices that they were purchased at previously. In a normal market, when demand falls away like this, GPU manufacturers start providing incentives and rebates so graphics card prices fall and become more competitive, especially if the current price is above the MSRP. They tend to like to bring it back down quite quickly. But in this crazy market where everything is all sorts of screwed up, these price adjustments and corrections are just not happening, so GPU prices are stagnating at a relatively high level. The prices for resupplies are not good either, meaning that when graphics cards do eventually get sold, they're being replaced with stock that's either the same price or a higher price. Unless something changes, based on what we're hearing, we're expecting graphics cards to get more expensive over time as current stock sells out. However, with demand being low and cards selling out slowly, it could be a while before we see prices go up by any sort of significant amount. It's something we'll need to keep tracking. In terms of how much graphics card buyers are getting screwed right now, most models are between 5 and 25% more expensive than the advertised US MSRP. On average, across all models in all regions, the GPU market is sitting 16% above MSRP. That's certainly not amazing, especially because 6 months ago you could easily purchase most models at the MSRP, but a silver lining here is the GPU market is not currently as bad as the DRAM or SSD markets, where prices have doubled in the best cases and gone up by 5x in the worst cases. What's interesting is that I actually found the United States is suffering from the worst graphics card price inflation of any of the regions I looked at. Normally, PC gamers in the US have access to the best GPU prices, especially close to launch or at times when prices are a little out of whack. But right now, US graphics card prices are 22% above MSRP on average, the highest of these 9 regions. I haven't included Brazil here as I couldn't figure out the exact amount they charge for the insane import taxes and other duties that plague electronic prices in that region. And hey, this data is pretty good for us here in Australia. We're only paying 10% above the MSRP, with Germany not too far behind. I'd rather that number was 0 or even in the negatives, but I'll take that as a win for Team Down Under. The final question to answer is whether you should consider buying a graphics card right now at all. I certainly wouldn't be rushing out to buy one, especially if you have a GPU that's sufficient for playing the games you want to play. But if you're in desperate need of a GPU upgrade, or if you're building a PC for the first time, I don't think this is a situation where you can just wait for prices to improve. There are no signs of graphics card prices returning to MSRP levels anytime soon, especially for models with higher amounts of VRAM. It's a really rough time to be in a position where you need a GPU upgrade or you want to build a brand new system. I feel for people who are kind of stuck in that situation right now. I guess if I was to think positively about all of this though, I was expecting GPU prices to be worse at this point. Some models are really badly priced, don't get me wrong, but if you look at the DDR5 market, I'm thankful that things are not at that level yet. The 9070 XT is just 8% above the MSRP on average in a crazy market. The 5070 is 11% above the MSRP, and amazingly, you can still buy a 16GB GPU for under $450 US. Things were a lot worse back when crypto mining screwed up graphics card prices, so fingers crossed that what we're going through now doesn't reach those sorts of levels. So anyway, that's it for this one. If you're interested in supporting Hardware Unboxed and the independent testing and analysis that we do, please consider supporting us via Patreon. Links are in the description below. But aside from that, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.